I mean, I see us on the Facebook page.
You do?
Uh-huh.
We should be smiling.
Well,
Oh, I see us too.
So good evening and welcome to our Facebook Live discussion on racial trauma and racism recovery. Tonight, I, Miriam Jernigan Nowinski, joined with my esteemed alumni of the Toolkit for the Study and Promotion of Racial Culture at Boston College under the direction of Dr. Janet Knell. In an effort to orient our discussion tonight, before we dive in, just a little bit of background. In 2014, we actually began drafting what is now known as #RacialTraumaIsReal. The draft followed a lack of indictments of police officers involved in the killing of Black women and men in the United States. Some of those names are noted, others were later added, and yet the list of names which are in the manuscript does not begin to capture the number of lives lost due to violence against our Black siblings, as well as other Indigenous and people of color. For those of you who may be less familiar with the ISPRC, or the Institute as we affectionately call it, whose page we are on this evening, as well as less familiar with Racial Trauma is Real, I do encourage you to go to the ISPRC webpage and to download the Racial Trauma Toolkit, which is what we will be discussing tonight. Racial trauma is a topic that is not new to many of us in the field of psychology or to mental health providers. It is, however, terminology that is gaining widespread usage amongst the general population as well as the media. And we're happy about this. Racial trauma is officially the term that we use to describe the psychological as well as the physiological symptoms and consequences that Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, a term you might hear us refer to as BIPOC this evening, often experience after being exposed to racism. As individuals become more familiar with the topic of racial trauma, especially given our most recent public wave of anti-Blackness, violence against Black bodies, and racism, we thought it would be really important to have a conversation with the community, to offer resources and recommendations for how to identify the individual consequences of racism and to survive and facilitate your healing. It is our hope to engage you and to allow you to follow along in developing your own racial trauma toolkits, which will allow you to become proactive in identifying and addressing symptoms related to racial trauma. For our white identified allies who join us tonight, we hope this is a resource that you encourage other BIPOC people to use. So without further ado, I will actually turn it over to Dr. Green, who will get us started for the evening.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dr. Carlton Green. I use he, him, and his pronouns. It's really my pleasure to be here with my esteemed, brilliant colleagues. So let's just go ahead and jump right in. What I'm also gonna start by asking you to do is maybe make sure that you have yourself something to write with and to write on, or if you have your phone or your computer, wherever it is that you would wanna take notes, because we are going to be giving you some instruction tonight for some things that we think that you might wanna make note of. And that's actually one of the places that I wanna start. The reason why we want you to be thinking about starting here which is creating your racial wellness toolbox, which is a place that you can go and you can have everything in one place. The racial wellness toolbox becomes important because when you are stressed, what we know from stress is that it actually compromises your capacity to make good decisions. It compromises your capacity to remember. You are in a place where you are actually probably operating in your right brain, which is the place where we experience a lot of emotion. And what we need to do is be able to shift over to our left brain where we make good decisions. We know how to moderate our stress. We know how to engage other people. We can make some really conscious ways of thinking about what it is that we need to do in those moments, right? So when you're stressed and you don't know what to do or you're really flooded, being able to know that you have this racial wellness toolbox is one of the most important parts of this, right? And you're going to be coming back to the racial wellness toolbox throughout the conversation, right? So let's start with the first question for the racial wellness toolbox. And I'm going to drop down a few questions, but I want you to start with thinking about when you are well, when you are managing well, how do you know? What are you doing? What are your behaviors? What are the activities that you're engaged in? I'm going to ask a few of my peers here to unmute themselves and maybe get a few of them to talk about when they know that they're doing well, they are doing X, or they are feeling X, or X is going on in their life. So Cynthia, you are unmuted, so I'm just going to come to you first. Somebody else unmute themselves so we can go to you. Give us an example of something that really epitomizes when you're doing well.
I know I'm doing well when I'm regularly reaching out to my friends. I've scheduled social time with them. Of course, some of this has changed because of the pandemic, but even scheduling phone calls with them or bike rides, preparing healthy meals. That's a huge one for me. Those are some of the signs that I'm taking good care of myself.
Right. So there's, and one of you others, go ahead and mute yourself too so that I can call on you. But just thinking in terms of Cynthia describing things that are sort of like when she's at her equilibrium, when things are well, when she's not too stressed, when she's not under motivated, these are the types of things that she has going on in her life. Give me somebody else to describe. Miriam, tell us a little bit about what's going on with you when you're doing well.
I feel like for me, when I'm doing well, I don't, I'm noticing that my mood is much more even. Right. So I'm less irritable, for example. I'm able to kind of access and enjoy and kind of be in the moment, which is something that's really important for me. So I think when that doesn't happen, I tend to notice that I'm, more irritable or tired or fatigued. So for me, it's about being able to experience, my emotions and the feeling of just being content.
Right. So Miriam has actually shifted us into the next question is, what are you feeling emotionally? And so thinking about being at peace, being able to focus where you are, being able to have some sense of the current moment, that becomes really important too. When you are doing well emotionally, what does that feel like for you? Or what does that look like? Are you somebody who laughs a lot? Are you somebody who is just able to sit in peace with your own body? Are you somebody who is able to ward off irritability when it shows up, because it shows up, right? So begin to think about and list out the things that you are doing well. I mean, the things that you're doing when you're doing well. Also begin to think about what you're feeling when you're doing well. And Miriam was also actually modeling for us, how do we take advantage of the information that comes from our bodies, right? There's one way to think about doing well, but when you're feeling well, your body actually experiences that. And then the last question that's there, well, I guess how do you feel physically? Yeah, we've gone through all those. Another way of thinking about this, I'm going to pass it on to the next person who I actually don't know who it is. Somebody put it in the chat box so I can pass it off. There you go. Is to be thinking about domains of your life, right? So if you want to think about the psychological domain or the spiritual domain, or the physical domain, or if there's like a professional domain, you can also start there to think about when I'm well, these are the things that are going well in my life, right? In these particular areas. Even sort of like the racial cultural domain. If there are things that you're doing well for yourself that are sort of like, I'm engaging in certain racial or cultural practices, whether or not that's about cooking or about sort of like you enjoy certain types of music or you're doing certain types of things in sort of like a cultural community, be able to list those things out too, right? Because that becomes important. And one of the things that I'm gonna say before I hand it off to Anmol is that as you write these things down and you're thinking about how to enhance your toolbox, start in the areas where you're already doing well. Don't go to the areas where you don't have anything and try to come up with something. That becomes a little bit overwhelming, right? But start in the areas where you're already doing well and begin to build on those practices, because you'll get sort of like the oxytocin or the neurotransmitter that wards off the stress. It helps you to feel better about yourself. And that's something that you're going to need throughout this process, to be able to tap into those things that you do well, because it kicks in that boost that reminds you that you are a good person and you will be able to survive this, right? So that's step one, build your racial wellness toolbox with those questions. I'm gonna hand it off to Dr. Satyani now.
So thank you, Dr. Green. So my name is Anmol Satyani. I use she, her, hers pronouns. And I just want to build upon what we've just talked about. The next step really then, after you've thought about some things that you could do for yourself, is then maintaining that on a daily basis. And I think that becomes particularly challenging when one is in a lot of distress, and particularly when there is racial trauma that's occurring. And so I want to just mention again the domain. So, thinking about, am I attending to the physical domain? Am I, for example, getting outside, going for walks, doing something within the body? And I think with the body, and we're going to be talking a little bit more about that in a minute. The psychological, emotional, what am I doing for my mood? And maybe part of that is the reaching out to others. When I'm in distress, am I able to continue to, as Dr. Chen was saying, reach out? And just to keep in mind too, that reaching out not only helps us, but it also helps others. And I think one thing to consider, particularly around race and racism, is the question of who do we reach out to? And I think some of the toolkit kind of covers this, but the idea of reaching out to people who have a racial consciousness, and not necessarily people with whom there's going to be struggle or it's going to be kind of challenging to talk with them. That if you're in distress around a racial incident or experiencing racism, that may not be the best time to do that. So just having that in mind. And I think too a lot about the spiritual, and really drawing upon maybe our own indigenous healing systems in our families and our communities. And just as a personal example, one of those for me is yoga. And for me, yoga is important, not just physically, but on a spiritual level. And it's something that I can draw upon in difficult times, and something that I'm trying to maintain, that I try to maintain in my schedule. And really thinking about how can we do that, particularly in a difficult time. And it may be that it's not perfect, it's not the same as when you're doing well, but still trying to find a way to build that in. So I want to pause here, and I want to just ask others here how they are maintaining some of the strategies that they tend to use generally. Keisha, do you have any ideas?
Second. Hi everyone. I'm Dr. Keisha Bazada. So some of the ways that I try to maintain is by making sure that I am, taking walks when I can every day. So being out in nature is something that's important to me. Being able to kind of smell the fresh air, right? So those are things that's what's important to me, and also just spending like time with my family. In terms of spirituality, using prayer has been something that's been helpful for me, particularly. So I make sure that, before I go to bed at night, I'm like praying for my community, praying for my family, for my friends. Mm-hmm. So that's, those are some of the ways that I maintain during these times.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Others want to add?
For me, the idea of daily maintenance, I think, becomes important. It's the idea of kind of habituation is how I like to think about it. So regular physical activity is really important for me, more days of the week than not. And I think depending on how one feels, the rigor of that physical activity for me may change. There are some days where I really want to move my body, in an effort to release stress hormones, if we're connecting it to the physiology. And there are other days when I might want to do, more slow, deliberate, kind of intentional still practices. But the idea of moving the body, I think for me is really important, as well as really attending to, things related to nutrition. So I try, to be mindful on a daily basis in general about what I'm putting into my body. But I think being connected to the idea that, what stress does to the body, and that experiences of racism, lead to increased experiences of stress. I try to remind myself that I want my body to be able to function under optimal stress. And that requires, going back to biology lessons, but that requires some intentionality about what I'm putting in my body. And I think that's, for me, important because the tendency, I know when we wrote this back in 2014, we talked about the fact that, sometimes we get into those spaces where you want the sweets or the things that are more comforting. And I think that can be important. And I would encourage that, but also, again, being mindful and balanced, because again, the idea is that the body's being compromised. So the more that I can do that on a regular basis, for me, then it's just about reminding myself to maybe, lean into that a little bit more during increased times of stress like we are now.
Mm-hmm. I mean, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'll add, it's really brief, is that those are the people on this call know me, and people who are probably watching, some of them know me too. The thing that I do that I know that if I miss it is listen to my gospel music. It is one of the things that actually keeps me grounded and keeps me energized and keeps me going. And I think that even here, one of the things I've certainly learned during the pandemic, but I was trying to put in place probably this past year or two, is to make sure that I was drinking more water. Just for my body's sake, right? Having the natural elixir that water is, helping to flush through toxins, helping to regulate my system has been really, really critical. And also trying to cut out sugar. I haven't done so well with that right now, but I've been trying to cut out sugar, yes.
I'm with you on that. I haven't been very good at it either, but trying, yeah. I think the other thing that I think about related to what you both have said, or all three of you have said, is sleep. That sometimes that is one thing that goes very quickly when we're under a lot of stress. And so really trying to, go to bed at the same time every night, trying to wake up around the same time, trying to make sure that we get enough rest, that our bodies, our minds, our souls, we need rest too. So I think on that note, I don't want to go over my time. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Cynthia Chen.
Thanks, Anmal. Again, my name is Dr. Cynthia Chen. I use she, her pronouns. And, the next step in the racial trauma toolkit is thinking about how do we know when we have been triggered by a racial event. And so, I know for myself, sleep, like we just talked about, is one of those things. My bedtime will tend to shift to later because I just don't find myself tired. And then on the other hand, it can also mean that I'm going to bed way earlier than usual. So I sometimes experience both sides of those things. And, these things can be, we want to list out things that happen to us physiologically, spiritually, emotionally, physically, like we've been mentioning. And so I wonder with my colleagues, like what are their responses that they know are indicating for them that they've been triggered? Anybody? Am I calling on somebody? I'm all.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, definitely mood shifts where I'm not feeling the same kind of contentment, which I generally feel. I think a lot of fatigue, not having the same energy that I normally have, and yes, my sleep is often thrown off. So that's a good, like if I'm up a lot later than usual because I'm reading the news, for example, or something like that, then I know I've got to really keep an eye on that.
Yeah, I think sleep is a super common one. Anybody else have a different response that they notice for themselves?
Oh, I was going to say sleep too. No, for me, it's definitely, I experience insomnia. Lately, I've been noticing I've been going to sleep like at 2 o'clock in the morning. And it's hard having like a 5-month-old baby that I know is going to wake up at a certain time. So I know I need to get, my sleep, and I can't rely on old strategies I used to use when I was in grad school, like taking Benadryl to go to sleep. So I've been trying to be a little bit more mindful about, the ways in which I transition from my day until, to the night. So making sure that I'm not watching the news past a certain hour, right? And so I know that's something that I've been trying to be intentional about doing for myself. And it also, another thing that happens for me is I notice I experience like gastrointestinal issues, right? And so I've been trying to be more mindful about, what I am putting into my body.
I
would add that for me, it feels like, especially when there are interpersonal race-related stressors, I ruminate a lot. It becomes sort of like, it's just like this running train where I'm trying to figure out how to maybe say something profane to the person who I'm so like engaged in my head with, or trying to figure out what did I do or what could I have done differently, like some of the ruminations, but also even you can hear it now. So like some of the self-blame or some of the self-introspection that kind of gets on a loop as well. It becomes really difficult to shake that. I remember once I was ruminating on something and actually drove through a red light, right, because my mind was not even present where I was. And I remember driving through thinking, Lord, I need to get this woman out of my head because this is going to kill me, right? So the ruminations is really an indicator for me.
Yeah. Thank you all for sharing all of those. And, I think it's, for me, it makes sense to think about, what my responses are that tell me that I have been triggered. And then, I think it's also important to think about then to backtrack to what happened today or in the recent past that may have triggered these responses for me, and to be specific about them. And so, I think Dr. Bosley mentioned like watching the news before going to bed and how that is not a great strategy for a good night of sleep. And I do the same thing. I am so guilty of scrolling through social media Facebook and Instagram especially, and somehow I got onto Twitter. I don't watch as much like news on the TV, but all of those things, doing that like periodically throughout the day, I notice that the more increased exposure I have to those things, the more of these triggered responses I have. I think it's also important to think about if there's a specific kind of way that the news hits us. Like I know one of the pieces we mentioned in our original manuscript was back then, I think Facebook, and they would just play the videos, or when you went to Google News or whatever, it would just play the videos. And we all talked about how do we try to avoid, or can we have a choice in whether or not we're exposed to that level of stimulation and those kinds of racial events.
Yes.
Go ahead, Miriam.
It's interesting hearing you all talk, because I'm also realizing in the moment that for me, and it's interesting, I wonder if folks might also resonate with this who are listening. Sometimes when I'm triggered, I think I can relate to what you all said. I am noticing more and more, though, that my actual response is withdrawal and going really, really, really inwards. I get really quiet. I can naturally be a quiet person depending on where I am, but I'm sort of thinking about feedback I've heard from other folks where it's like, okay, you're not saying anything, right? So I go really inward, and it's not like a deliberate withdrawal where I'm isolating myself. It's not quite that. So I'm wondering and wanting folks to also pay attention to, as we think about, there may be ways that you're not sleeping as well, but there may be ways in which, sort of going inward in oneself. And so whether it's ruminating, to your point, Carlton, or just kind of thinking about things, but I'm really quiet. I'm not as verbal. I'm not as interactive from an interpersonal standpoint, even though there are things that are happening. So it's almost as if my body's protecting me as well, right? They're really slowing down. But it can affect, right, some of my interpersonal relationships. Triggered.
Thanks for sharing that, Miriam. Like, one of the pieces that I mentioned with Dr. Green was that, I know I'm doing well when I am reaching out. And so then the back end of that, right, is that I've withdrawn, I've stopped making invitations to my friends or reaching out to them. And so thank you for bringing us back to that too. Mm-hmm. And then I think, and I'm trying to be mindful of time, but I think it's important then, after you have, how do you know that you've been triggered? What are some of the triggers that can elicit those types of responses? And then of course, how do you cope? What are the things that will help you sleep better, help you want to be more connected, help you stop ruminating, help you, be more mindful of your sugar intake? And so, like, what are some of those things that you can do, and how do you know that they work?
Can I add one thing before you move on, Cynthia? Is that this has happened on my campus a lot. And so I just want to make sure that I mention this. One of the other pieces that we know that can trigger us could be holiday celebrations for folks. I know here, Halloween was a really difficult time as we were thinking about people dressing up as and impersonating or donning culturally inappropriate attire for folks, or thinking about other holidays too, like the Columbus holoday, or other ones where people of color have been marginalized historically while vaunting some white figure. It feels like the current time that we live in, there's a lot of attunement to that, or there's more attunement and more public outcry to that. And a lot of students, especially on college campuses, are really finding some of those experiences really triggering.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that.
I was going to say that's the notion of triggers, all right? As we think about what triggers us, I think it's easy to immediately focus on the things that are more explicit, but that's a really good point, Dr. Green, because, we were having the conversation, we being all of us, having the conversation about, you think about the history of race and racism, there are so many potential triggers, right, in everyday language. In the buildings, the places, the spaces, right, where we're not represented. And so just encouraging folks to be mindful that it's not always, right, the video that shows up on the media or the person that says something really explicit to you, right? That's the overt experience of racism, racial discrimination, but the subtleties that also occur. on, almost an everyday basis. And for those folks who are really into history, I am, just even thinking about, I was talking about even conversations more recently about, for example, race and policing, and looking at the history of things like paddy wagons and what that meant with regard to slavery, for example, but it shows up, right, in common language, depending on the conversation, are subtle. But when you know those connections, there's still, right, triggers that may activate you in ways that, if you're not attuned to, you're not, aware of.
And we could probably keep going on and on about this stuff, right? I just
Right.
want to add something to what Miriam is saying. I think that it really underscores the reason why we encourage people to really be in contact with their own bodies, really have some sense of what's happening. Because when, like, if you're reading something, or if you are in a place where a name does appear or something is said, and you feel that slightness in your body of sort of like, oh, did that just happen, right? Or was that just said? Or did they really mean what they did? That's probably an indicator that you might be experiencing a trigger at that moment. So it's really important to pay attention to your body.
Thank you.
And thinking about triggers before we shift to the next piece, because there's a Facebook question that I think is triggering. If folks want to take a look at that, from Kathy Liu, who's asking if Asian or Pacific Islanders are considered BIPOC, because there was a white psychologist colleague tell Kathy Liu that they didn't think Asians or Asian Americans are considered people of color. Anybody want to comment?
Deep breaths, Kathy. Deep breaths.
Trigger.
I know I identify as a person of color and as an Asian American woman. And I guess I would want to challenge my white colleague. How come, I'm trying to say this nicely. Like, if I identify as a person of color, what gives them the expertise or the power, the privilege to say that I don't belong in that community? That would be my response.
I would say too, they're just, I identify as South Asian American. There are many historical examples that illustrate how Asian Americans, the APITA community, has been marginalized, not given rights, Japanese internment. I mean, I could go on and on. We could spend a lot of time on this, but not to mention people's daily experiences. But I also feel like this is a larger issue of pitting groups against each other. This whole idea of the APITA community somehow being an example, and if they made it, then why can't the other groups make it? And I mean, this is a much larger conversation, but I think that there's a lot to unpack in that statement.
Right. Even as we talk about the anti-Blackness that's occurring in the country today, right? So to just follow up on what Anmol is saying is in some ways, this white colleague who is not necessarily taking the time to be respectful of you, and we really want to apologize that this happened to you, Kathy. They're not taking consideration of who you are. They're not reading history properly. They're actually trying to situate you almost as sort of like the model minority, which in and of itself is an offensive, triggering term for a lot of Asian American folks. One of the things that we talk about, that having learned from Dr. Helms around racial identity theory is that, if you don't need to be in relationship with this person, that might be somebody that you don't want to be in relationship with, because they might be like really hurting your own racial self-concept, your racial self-pride.
Thanks for the question, Kathy. And I'd like to introduce Dr. Basilev, who will take over for the next section.
Hi, everyone. So Dr. Keisha Basilev. So as we discussed earlier, racial trauma can be experienced both physically and psychologically, right? So it's important to really pay attention to your body and note any changes that you might be experiencing following like a race-based incident or racial violence, right? So some of the things that you want to pay particular attention to include increases in pressure, heat, muscle tension, tingling sensations or feelings of numbness that you might experience in certain areas of your body. these physiological symptoms are your body's way of telling you that something is not right, and it's preparing you to react to a threat. So you're basically entering into like flight or fight mode. So some common physical symptoms that you might experience include like increase in body aches, more tension in areas such as your shoulders, your back, your neck, your legs. Some people might experience like frequent headaches or migraines. I know we already talked about like having the sleep disturbances or like gastrointestinal issues. So I'm just wondering, like from my colleagues here, like what are some of your early warning signs that you experience?
Okay, so we have dead space. I'll go. I think that for me, one of the early warning signs is always I stop eating the way that I generally do. Like I try to. I'm not as good as Dr. Miriam, but I do try to like make sure that I'm eating certain meals per day. And then when as the racial stress comes on, I can have a real clear recollection. Well, a few hours later, I'll be like, oh, I missed that meal. Or the next day, I'll be like, I only ate once yesterday. It's one of the real indicators for me that I'm experiencing a lot of stress. And then Dr. Jernigan has always also pointed out that for me, one of the warning signs is I do begin to sort of like pull back and burrow in and start working on things, probably as a way of being able to work through some of my energy, but I become really much more disconnected than I generally am.
Okay.
For me, it's a different type of fatigue. I mean, you all know me. I sleep, right? I'll go to bed at 9 o'clock. I'm up early, but I like 7 to 8 hours of sleep. And I think even with that, I'm not getting as much, being a mother, but of a young child. But at the same time, when I'm getting that sort of typical amount of sleep that I'm used to, and I still feel tired, it's more of a fatigue, and in some cases, if it's really extreme, it's just like I've heard folks say, like, I feel just kind of bone tired, right? So you're almost sluggish, getting through activities, things feel like they're moving, sometimes is warning signs, I think, for me.
Okay. I know one of the things that, tends to happen sometimes, like when you're feeling anger, you might experience more like clenching of your jaw or your fists. I know Dr. Jernigan gave us an example of like getting hot ears sometimes. So, so you notice like different parts of your body might get elevated in temperature. So those are some things you really need to kind of pay attention to, what's going on with you physiologically, and then also tying that into like your emotional responses. So are you having an increase in anger, feelings of shame, feelings of guilt, self-blame, confusion? So what's going on for you as you're reacting to experiences of racial trauma?
If I could add to that, in thinking about, the idea of confusion or disorganization, et cetera, it's, also wanting folks to think about what that looks like on a day-to-day basis, right? So are you feeling like it's hard to organize a work-related task, or that you started out doing a particular task at home and then you started doing something, something else, and are really tangential, in your activities, or even how you're communicating information verbally. I think the other thing that we, also talked about is just interpersonally is the other domain for me. So that anger, right, or irritability or lack of frustration tolerance may show up when you're, if you have folks around you that you're close to. I've heard, for example, and worked with other caretakers who talk about, having less patience for their children, and then they find, or at least, maybe there's someone who can give them feedback. You're yelling, at the kids a lot, that sort of thing, or you're really being, sort of snappy with me, that sort of thing. And so really paying attention to how or what this looks like for you. So I also encourage folks that may have people around them to give gentle feedback, right? As you facilitate your awareness and build your racial trauma toolkits, listen to some of the feedback and begin to connect that with some of these other aspects that we're talking about, like what you're feeling in your body, and attending to what it is that you're feeling emotionally, affectively.
Right. I totally agree with that. So I guess in terms of like thinking about a response plan, right? So you need to be proactive and respond to like when you start noticing these symptoms. So your plan's going to look very different from someone else's, because not everyone experiences the same physical or emotional responses. and people have different strategies for healing. So I know we talked a little bit about, you know, what do you do when you're experiencing insomnia or fatigue. We also talked about when you're experiencing, well, what was I going to say? So if you're experiencing like body aches or headaches, like some of the things that you might try to engage in are progressive muscle relaxation exercises or deep breathing exercises to help with releasing that tension in your body. One of the things I tend to do for myself, in terms of like grounding or mindfulness techniques, like I mentioned before, I like to take walks or sometimes light candles. So those are the things that I do like physically to help me with like responding to some of my early warning signs that I'm experiencing. With regard to food, I know Dr. Jernigan mentioned like making sure that you're putting in the right foods into your body. So kind of being mindful of like maybe having healthy snacks. Meal prepping might be something that you might want to engage in at this time. Because we want to be careful of like reaching for those unhealthy foods. That's going to help, that's going to slow you down, maybe increase your blood pressure, which is something that's very common in you know, communities of color. So these are some things that you have to kind of really start thinking about and maybe putting that into your racism wellness toolkit. So I guess from my colleagues, what are some things that you found helpful in terms of managing your own warning signs?
So I had to, because a couple things about the eating healthy is that I love my carbs, more on the salty side than the sweet, but I have to just not have it in the house. And then I actually was looking through some of the meal delivery kits that are a little bit healthier. I talked about with Dr. Green, I think last week or the week before. And, you know, so many of them are more like comfort food style. And I had to like a hungry route if I'm not being paid, but it's generally a little bit more healthy. It's quick to prepare. And I find that just doing that helps me stay on track so much better for my nutrition.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I think, yeah, I was going to say for me, definitely being outside helps a lot. I really need to be in nature. And yoga, again, I would say, I mean, I think I can sort of notice which parts of like where the stress is, where it is in my body. And fortunately, during this pandemic, my yoga instructor has been offering not just online classes, which I haven't been able to attend, but she's also, she has short videos. So I'm able to do those, you know, like every night, which has been incredibly helpful. And they're short, they're 20 minutes, maybe 30 minutes. So it's easy to also incorporate into my schedule, but that has helped a lot. And they focus on different parts of the body. So she has like a head and neck, you know, video. And then there's one on lower back, there's one on shoulders. So it's been incredibly helpful.
I would say connection. You know, and I'll use us on the call and those who are unable to be with us tonight as an example, right? We connected in 2014. That's how the idea of the manuscript was born. We connected more recently. I sent an email saying, I really need you all, right? So for me, what helps is understanding the different roles that I have, and certainly as an educator, as a health provider, as an instructor, there are places where I teach. But in moments like this, I need to connect with people that I know understand, can validate. So I'm very, very selective about where I choose, right, to put my energy in terms of outside of work-related responsibilities. So who I connect with. So I don't have to explain myself or explain racism for that matter to anyone, but I look to the folks, you all, right, that I know are both in the fight, are also can relate to the types of roles that I may have as a woman, as a mother, as an et cetera. And so we don't have to give a backstory. We can just validate one another and connect. And that includes, right, just, validating each other, but also laughing and trying to, be with one another has been really helpful for me. It was helpful then, and it's helpful now.
I was going to say something that kind of goes A little bit differently than what other people have been sharing. I think that for me, one of the indicators is that I do feel a bit more teary-eyed, or I'm crying a little bit more. I think that what I've tried to learn how to do is just really allow that to come on, such that I'm not fighting it off, but really so like being with the emotion that comes up, whether or not it's about the sadness or the rage, but really allowing that to just flow through my body, so that I can be in touch with whatever information there is that comes with that, rather than avoiding that. So just sitting with the emotion is also one of the ways that I feel like I'm trying to do that differently.
Yeah. Okay. Great. I was going to mention that, one of the ways like Miriam mentioned, like, seeking support from friends, but being intentional about the people that you are seeking support from, because not everyone's going to be able to have those conversations about race and racism with you, or are going to be able to support you in the way that you need to be supported, right? And so it's just be very intentional about who you're selecting to reach out to for support. If you're reaching out to a professional provider, also making sure that that person is able to understand what your trauma is, and then who you are as a racial or cultural individual, right? And so you want to be very intentional about who you're selecting as your professional provider. And one of the things my partner had also mentioned, I was having discussions with him, is like, it's important to listen to and read scholars who have done this work, right? And so like people like Janet Helms or Nellie Fuller, Amos Wilson, these are people who have talked about these issues and have laid the groundwork for us to be able to kind of process race and racism and how it's impacting us psychologically. And so I think it's important to like educate yourself. So I'm gonna be mindful of the time and pass the torch over to Dr. Jernigan Nwesi, who's gonna talk about the next step in the plan.
Before you do, Miriam, one quick thing in the comments, somebody was asking for the body exercise website, Unmold, that you mentioned. They're wanting to have that as a resource.
It's actually my personal yoga instructor's information. I can share, maybe I can share it on Facebook, just her contact info.
And we do see, see other questions, particularly Becca. We know you have a question, so it's noted. We're going to come to it in terms of some of the more therapeutic related questions. So we also see the question about just processing. I'm sorry, I've got a little sun glare, so I'm going to shift or try to shift a little bit. I actually am going to talk a little bit about acute racial trauma and response. And by acute, so I think starting off with just a little bit of a definition, we've talked about, daily maintenance and triggers, early warning signs, and the experience of racial trauma. But acute racial trauma really speaks to the really heightened emotional responses to experiences of racism. So typically when we see or talk about folks who experience acute stress, for example, and in this case, we're looking at those acute experiences following racially traumatic events. There are a few things for me that come to mind. One being, if we're sort of thinking about what may be the trigger, right? That this is something that a person can experience directly, but also is related to things that you may be witnessing. Particularly witnessing with regard to the physical safety or integrity of yourself or someone else. But distress is going to be the key factor here in terms of thinking about the heightened emotional response. Distress as it pertains to really disrupting important areas of your life. So think about the things that you need to or typically do on a daily basis. So social settings, work settings, etc. And so when if you're experiencing disruption to that for some of the reasons that we mentioned, inability to maybe focus or, to remain organized, for example, to complete specific tasks. Also just your inability to talk about the specific event can be an indicator of that significant distress that I'm talking about. Typically acute responses are going to occur within, 1 month, within a few days and up to about a month of the event that may be identified, event or events. Part of me, as I even talk about just the acute experience, is also recognizing the cumulative effects of racial trauma. So as we talk about, as I said, this latest wave of events, a lot of folks will reference George Floyd, but throughout the pandemic experience, if we go back to Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, and other individuals, there's something about the cumulative experience of seeing such events in the news cycle that I'm aware of may lead to, right, heightened experiences of emotions and distress for individuals. Some of these more specific symptoms that I tend to look for, or in some cases may experience, because they're acute experiences and the emotions are even more heightened than we've described already, some folks may report feeling more detached, which is different than just being withdrawn. So there's a numbness that may occur for individuals. They may feel like in their relationships that they can't really respond to their own emotions or to the emotions of other individuals. They're less aware about their, kind of day to day or about their, about their surroundings. So you're just kind of going through the motions in some cases. And heightened experiences, some folks will say that their environments just sort of, things just feel strange, right? And less familiar, even though this is, your life that you're living in your daily activities. In some cases, it also could just be hard to remember, right? So you've had this or witnessed a racially traumatic event, and then it's difficult to really report or remember the aspects of that. So there's in some cases, that experience, also the re-experiencing. So other folks may have, recurring images, thoughts, nightmares, flashbacks, feeling like they're reliving the actual event, which again is accompanied by that distress. In other cases, looking at avoidance. So avoiding, maybe the site of where something happened, or even avoiding, if you're witnessing something, avoiding, the mechanism by which you may have witnessed a video, et cetera. Avoiding people, conversations with, individuals, activities that you might have typically engaged in, thoughts, feelings. And we also, I would say more formally, and I'm speaking more on my psychology brain here, hear folks talk about just increased experiences of arousal, which they can feel physiologically, also maybe emotional arousal like anxiety. So that's where we again go back to those things such as difficulty sleeping, feeling irritable, difficulty concentrating, difficulty staying still, sitting still, etc. So in addition to what Keisha mentioned, the idea of, again, really looking at these more significant emotional experiences as being an indicator of what may be more of an acute response to a situation. And I think for me, what's interesting, or the things contextually that inform that, as I said, are perhaps how many exposures a person has been exposed to in a given period of time, racially traumatic or racially triggering experiences. Also a person's own history, right, of racial discrimination, racial socialization. So you may be witnessing or experiencing racism and not have a blueprint. I'm trained as a child and adolescent provider, and I can distinctly remember having conversations with adolescents, maybe about 10 years ago, whose parents or caretakers, for example, had not had conversations with them about race or racism, and yet they were in, these were Black adolescents who were in predominantly white academic settings, and their descriptions of their settings were obvious to me that they were having pretty significant racist encounters on a almost daily basis, but they didn't have a blueprint, right? No one had talked to them about identifying or having strategies, and so their responses may have emerged behaviorally, but that idea, again, of what may inform or allow you to understand what may lead to that contextual or heightened experience, I think is really interesting. But really, there are a lot of factors, including one's own racial identity development, one's ability to understand racism, and one's, experiences, and how often those are happening. I imagine for many of us currently, there are a lot of folks that I have certainly heard describe, they can't catch their breath, right? That every time they turn on the television, there's another killing or death. And so that to me would, is a series of events that might lead to more acute experiences. Do folks have anything else that they would like to add in terms of whether it's be your own experiences or things that you've heard from, colleagues or folks that you're working with that really, allow folks to understand, yes, the racially traumatic experience, but also the really acute or significant experience that I'm referencing?
I've been working with a number of Black students just in the last several weeks who are describing similarly, as you were saying, having trouble breathing, not sleeping well, things are just really off for them. And then also feeling very on edge. And this is, I think, as a result of watching, another, just yet another Black person being killed, seeing the video over and over, and then wandering outside into their neighborhood, which may be predominantly white, wearing a mask because that's what they need to do during the pandemic, but then being told, being approached by people saying, do you really live in this neighborhood? You know, someone was describing to me recently that that they were just trying to relax outside in nature, and they saw a young black person being handcuffed, which later the handcuffs were removed, and so apparently it was no reason. There was no reason for it. So seeing this in their daily lives, not only on TV, just experience, you know, the re-experiencing this over and over. So.
I think the thing that I would add, having worked with a few Black male people in therapy, is that the sense of shame that comes to dominate a person's life, to the degree that they don't even operate as themselves anymore. They don't show up in spaces to actually give voice to who they are as a unique person. They can become really, really caught up in this narrative of the racially traumatic event is really all of who they are, and they weren't really able to do anything to defend themselves or to protect themselves or speak up for themselves. So there's a huge amount of internalized shame. The shame is really internalized deeply. The other piece that really comes to mind for me is that I've worked with folks who have reported, Black men in particular, who have reported having really healthy relationships with their partners or with their kids. And then what they notice is like this extreme shift in their capacity to be able to relate to that person or to those people that they really hold as significant in their lives. So the internal world that I've seen specifically with Black men clients really becomes dysregulated to the degree that it's hard to relate, and there's a really, really negative self-concept to the degree that the person actually thinks that something really is broken with them.
So as we transition, I would say we're sort of entering the last sort of area of the toolkit, which will open up to everyone. And also I should say we should welcome into the discussion, Dr. Janet Helms has joined us for the evening, and Dr. Kevin Hinsey, who's also going to help us really think about crisis planning and post-crisis planning. And then, you know, in the time that we have remaining, I encourage folks to ask other questions that we might be able to respond to as we open up and attempt to engage with the community of you all who are listening. I guess Dr. Hinsey and other folks, if you wanted to sort of talk about just this idea, right, of what is crisis planning and then post-crisis planning, and how do we understand that from a racial trauma perspective? Anyone can take that.
Thank you, Dr. Jernigan. I'm happy to speak briefly to this. I think when we're thinking about crisis planning, it's important to consider what that's going to look like, and it's ideal to be developing this plan, by the way, when you're not in crisis. So all of these things that we've been talking about tonight, it's ideal to try to do this when you're not in a crisis. Now, I will just name that that's a big ask, considering the level of racial trauma and crisis that's going on in the world, that the triggers we talked about, the warning signs, all of that is present. But how to develop this plan before you're actually in a crisis is important. So when we start thinking about, well, what does that crisis look like? Is that crisis really negative thoughts about others, such that maybe you're thinking about killing them, right? Or you're really thinking about doing something that is really out of your normal behavior or your character, but you're just so enraged that it doesn't matter anymore. A sense of profound hopelessness. Big thoughts. It will never change. I will never feel any different than I feel now. So really monitoring the narratives, the thoughts in one's mind. Are they really sort of absolute thoughts, right? It will never get better. Because those sorts of thoughts actually are part of what can feed the shame that Dr. Green talked about, but also thoughts about ending one's life. And that is obviously another sign of crisis. And yes, these are very painful and heavy topics that we're talking about now, but they're more common than I think is what's acknowledged. If you have an honest conversation with a person and they're willing to be vulnerable with you about some of their darkest moments, they will tell you that they have had a moment in their life where they at least had a passive thought that maybe it was never going to be better, and they might just want to, they don't care if they wake up. Or they might say, I was so angry at that person who just totally talked over me or took my idea and called it their own. Oftentimes, right, that's a white person that will do that in response to a Black, Indigenous person of color. And you're so angry that you think, you know, I'm gonna do something I wouldn't normally do, but I don't care. So this is what we're talking about with a crisis. What are the people you can reach out to? And oftentimes, by the time a person's at a crisis, it's sort of, you've moved beyond the place of being able to manage this on your own, usually. Most often, you gotta think about who are you reaching out to. You gotta have that short list of people, hopefully people you know and trust, but I would add, it doesn't hurt to throw on the National Suicide Prevention Crisis Line, because you're better off alive than dead, right? Have numbers available, have them programmed in your phone, be able to know who to reach out to and who to call.
Can I jump in here for a second, Kevin?
Please do, Dr. Green.
Certainly thinking about the audience, and I want to make sure that we do come back to you, especially as a white person on this panel, to talk more about being a white ally. I also want to make sure that we have space for a piece that just came up in the chat box, right? Really thinking about the rage or the fury or the anger that people experience that could turn into something that could appear harmful. I wonder if folks can talk to like this sense of rage and how maybe to move it from sort of like crisis to something that feels a little bit healing, right? I can start by talking about this. It's definitely thinking about rage, fury, anger. These are all very reasonable responses to racial trauma. They're all very reasonable responses to being discriminated against or being terrorized racially even by the people who are good white people who work on your job. It's still a reasonable response, right? And so what we have to recognize is that anger is actually a part of the energy that is really important for you to figure out how to move, how to heal yourself, how to find your own voice. The anger is not a bad thing, and we have to really move into being able to recognize that the anger is not a bad thing. I wonder if some of my other colleagues can talk about some of that anger, that rage, that fury, and how you would want people to be thinking about that.
Dr. Green, I appreciate the idea of thinking about it, reframing the narrative, right, around energy. So on the one hand, I want folks to get comfortable sitting with, right, the energy, particularly if you're working with folks around, in the area of racial trauma. So sitting with the anger, allowing folks to have that anger. And also, I think, reconstructing the narrative around what people need to do with that energy. So activism, including protest, is a way of shifting energy, and I think it's received particularly a negative connotation more recently, in the news in that regard. And there's a variety of factors, but that idea of activism is not always about the explicit protests that we see happening across the country. For some folks, the idea of activism may be doing something more locally in the community. It could be a poem. It could be, organizing an event, music, playing music, those sorts of things, right? So where are you channeling the energy to express and allow really the energy to and encouraging, I think, people to engage in activities that maybe they haven't more recently done that might allow for some of the energy shifts, but also encouraging people to maybe adopt or to try things that may be useful to them is something that I.
I'm observing in the chat box that somebody thinks that Dr. Helms has something to say about this. Dr. Helms, do you want to jump in here?
Well, I sort of want to, and you may have said this earlier, but I want to go back to the topic of crisis, because I think it's really important to determine whose crisis it is. Very often, if you are in a predominantly white setting and you're a person of color, suddenly the white person has a crisis. The crisis is that they haven't been listening to you all this time, but now they want you to retell your story so that they can listen to you. Well, that's not your crisis. That's their crisis. And actually, it's their bad behavior because they've not listened to you in the past when you probably told your story. So one of the things I especially am working on this week is the capacity to say, no, that's not my crisis, that's your crisis. Because if you're so busy helping someone else resolve their crisis, it's going to take a whole lot of work on their part, then you don't have time to work on your own. So that's kind of what I would like to say about that. And in that process, you will feel angry towards the white person who's supposed to be your ally. That's okay. It's even okay if you say to them, I'm angry that you have never talked to me about this before and now you want to. So this is your time to own your feelings.
I would echo that because I think that one of the really important lessons that I learned in graduate school in my final year at Boston College with Dr. Helms and Dr. Chen, as we were going through some consultation with some colleagues, some white colleagues, is that Cynthia and I felt like we couldn't say to our white colleague that we were disappointed in her or that we were really hurt by something that she did. And Dr. Helms really gave us permission, really, to be able to express that. And it felt like it was actually pretty healing for us. And it was also, I think it also led to a deepening of the relationship that we had with this particular white person. That's somebody that we still treasure and value to this day. And it's quite possible that if we had not moved into being able to let that person hold the feelings that we were having or give voice to the feelings, that the relationship might not have been saved. So it becomes really important to figure out how to give voice to what is actually yours.
I totally agree. And I think one of the things I want to talk in talking about anger is that, you know, for the folks here, they know that I much prefer to feel angry than to feel sad. And one of those things that I take about anger is that to me, there's an element of energy and almost hope that maybe there's something I can do, right? And that when I'm feeling sad or when I'm withdrawing, then like emotionally or psychologically, I'm feeling frozen, I'm feeling overwhelmed, I'm not sure what to do, I'm not sure there's anything I can do. Whereas when I'm feeling angry, I'm energized and I'm like, what is it I can do? And so I'd like to offer that reframe about those feelings of anger as well.
I wanted to echo also what Dr. Helms was saying, because I do think there are, and I've certainly felt this at points too, this sense of responsibility, like I need to talk to this white colleague about this, or I need to explain, or I need to help them understand. And, you know, I think the idea of preserving one's own energy, finding spaces to do one's own work is extremely important, especially when one is feeling really overloaded or just having a lot to deal with themselves. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I'll just share, it's similar sentiment. I was having a conversation with my life partner about this as well. And it's a space that I had to come to. I've been there for a while, as he will attest to, but just this idea of having to subject myself to pain because someone is now interested, that's not something, right? That's more compromising for me. So I am very comfortable saying no. And I think I was encouraging him in sort of shifting and saying, you know, why would you subject or feel like you would have to subject yourself, right? For the comfort, for the curiosity, you know, of your white colleagues. Why stay on a call that somebody else has put together as one of few people of color on the call to talk about, you know, your experiences with racism? And so if you feel, right, at any given time, especially because there's a lot of folks who are talking about places of employment, et cetera, and just getting random phone calls and text messages from white colleagues or people quite frankly, not friends, right? Friends may check in, but just folks that they don't really know. And so for me, I've encouraged a lot of people to say no. Students who are in training programs, even who's, programs think that they're well-intentioned by offering up a space, but they're offering up the pain, right, of the students who've had these direct experiences. And that just that's not comfortable. I just reserve the right to say no is my motto. And don't go silently. Is what I encourage my life partner. It's kind of like, let folks know that I am removing myself from the situation because it's not okay, right, with me, versus them making up a narrative about why I might be leaving the phone call. Let's be very clear about why I'm leaving the phone call, that I do not, choose to engage in this for the expense or pleasure or curiosity of someone else. There's some more work to be done and you all need to do it. So I'll leave it there. I'm aware of just some questions.
I just want to say one thing. Somebody put something into the chat that I think I lost it, that actually feels really important, or could be powerful for people to hear. Actually, one of my former students said, I really like the idea of considering rage as a powerful source of energy and the healing power of redirecting that energy. A metaphor that came to my mind is that if we compare rage like nuclear power, rather than using it to make a bomb, make it a power plant that can sustain our advocacy and constructive work in the long run.
Mhm.
Just wanted to share that.
I was going to say that, in terms of like channeling rage in a proactive manner, I think it's important to think about like who are the kids in your life that you can have those conversations with and kind of help mentor them, right? So I think that's an important kind of avenue that where you can channel that energy in a positive way, right? I think Dr. Jernigan always talks about like raising resistors, right? And so I think those are the things that you need to kind of like think about, like in terms of like when you're having conversations with your children or like your nieces and nephews, or people like your students that you're teaching, like, so how can you kind of raise resistors and get them to kind of like engage in activism?
That's actually a pretty nice segue and point that I'd like to make. I encourage any final thoughts from our audience there. I know there was a question earlier that I said we'd come back to, which was asking a very specific question about processing and treatment, et cetera. One of the reasons why we, wanted to have this conversation as open and available to as many people as possible was the same reason that we, chose intentionally not to publish the Racial Trauma is Real toolkit in an academic journal, was to get it to the folks who need it the most. So this for us is a beginning conversation. We did want to provide some resources. We did want to let folks know that I think out of demands and need, we often come together collectively. There are many strengths among us as folks who've been doing this work formally for many, many years. And so we do intend to have some upcoming trainings. One of the areas that I'm most passionate about, so this is Dr. Miriam Jernigan Noesi's kind of soapbox, is, as Keisha mentioned earlier, there are elders who've been doing this work for years. And with racial trauma becoming a term that's recognized, I noticed that there are a lot of folks who are interested, who are invested, I think rightfully so, in understanding, and in the case of formal treatment, wanting to engage in formal treatment. I feel very strongly that we know that there are many training programs in the field of mental health that did not acknowledge, right, race and racism as significant clinical issues. And so therefore it's highly unlikely that folks have had that training. So Keisha, Dr. Keisha also mentioned, and some other folks mentioned, education, but even though we're talking about racial and trauma, I've seen folks, for example, say, well, I'm trauma informed, I can do this work. I would argue humbly, Dr. Helms, or someone can correct me if I'm wrong, that's not the case, right? We're not just taking pieces of a model. So we intend to offer, I think, some more specific trainings. Someone else, I think, answered in the chat box and sort of said there are some specific trauma-informed approaches that that folks are attempting to kind of utilize and thinking about. And I think that's an important start. But there's also a body of work that informs work related to racial trauma, which includes racial identity theory, racial socialization, et cetera. So for folks who can't, I would say, do an assessment that includes an accurate and comprehensive racial socialization, racial identity development assessment, even in a clinical setting, pause. So if that's not something, if you're a provider and that, what does she mean by that? I would say that's an area to pause and maybe think about some additional training. And we hope to offer some of that. we certainly intend to have events. We encourage you all to, if you haven't liked the ISPRC page, to like the ISPRC page, where we will have more information, including information about the 20th annual Diversity Challenge Conference, which will happen virtually in October through the Institute and Dr. Helms. So there's the opportunity for folks to join. We always usually do, the advisory board usually does a panel. So we're trying to meet the needs of folks formally and informally, and hope to offer more programming. It would be really good to hear from you all. So if you could like the page, send messages, and let us know what the need is, we would appreciate that. And I know last year at the American Psychological Association conference, the team did a CEU workshop, which was, I think, the start of really beginning the training that is related to racial trauma work in particular. So I'll stop there. I don't want to talk too much, but I did want to let folks know, right, that there are future events, and we encourage you to follow the Institute as we continue to put out resources available to the public and point folks in directions, and to folks that we feel are adequately prepared to really engage in the work. I think it's important that we treat, identify, assess, and treat from a formal perspective, but you need to have the experience. That's my humble addition to the panel. If folks have other thoughts before we close out.
I would just add that I think the points that we've been talking about here at the end about what causes the crisis, and also how can, when we think about treatment, what is competent treatment? And it cannot be, these 2 points can't be lost, because I think what causes the crisis, I'm noticing some other comments from Facebook about, you know, folks who are in institutions who have woken up to racism, but meanwhile this has been part of maybe your experience for your life, and now they're waking up and wanting you. As it's been discussed, saying no is appropriate, setting boundaries is appropriate, but I also think there's an absolute necessity that the mostly white leadership of these organizations do their own work too, and learn that it doesn't matter if you're having good intentions. If you're creating racial trauma and crisis, that's on you. You got to do your own work. We have to talk about white people also doing their own work, which is another training. But it is very important. If you are a white clinician or therapist listening to this Facebook Live feed, and you've downloaded this racial recovery plan, and you're excited about it, I would say good to be excited, and absolutely be sure you're doing some reading and your own work on white racial identity. Do not go into a therapy session with a client of color and just present this as the very first time you've ever been talking with them about maybe substantially about race. So there's a lot to talk about here. Who's causing the crisis? Who can we reach out to for support? And everyone has to do their work.
Could I just add to that?
Please.
There is a tendency for institutions to have suddenly woke, quote unquote. And to them, that means that they will now reach out to the person of color or to the white ally to do all of the diversity training on their campus for free. I am encouraging people to say no to that. If the service is important, then they ought to pay for it. And there are people out in the world who can do this kind of work for an institution, but they need to hire them rather than thinking that they can get this done for free. You get what you pay for. And so in addition to doing your own individual work, a part of activism is saying to your institution, if you hire people to tell you how to reshape your curriculum, for example, there are experts who know about race and racial trauma that you ought to be willing to pay to come in and do the work.
I wanted to add another point too, which is just that I think that non-Black people of color also need to be doing work and really addressing anti-Blackness in our own communities, and I think that that's also a crucial part of it.
Agree. Thanks, Anmol. another last thought that I was having is just about how as we develop these plans for ourselves and for recovering from racist events or being exposed to racism chronically and continuously, that you may need to update these on a regular basis. You know, the plan that I was using before the pandemic, certainly I needed to update it, you know, when we went into lockdown. And, you know, as your community changes, you will probably update, like, who are the folks that you reach out to, or what are the activities that you're engaging in that promote your wellness.
I will just say, for folks who we're noticing are just coming out, just remind folks to certainly follow the Institute for the Study and Promotion of Race and Culture's Facebook page, but also go to the actual website, because you can find the hashtag Racial Trauma is Real manuscript there, along with the toolkit and an infographic. There are plenty of folks who ask us sometimes to utilize or to modify. We just ask that you use the, accurately use the citation. But certainly we are more interested in disseminating it if it can be of use for individuals. I'm looking at final questions. Yes, this is being recorded as a live stream when it ends because it's via Facebook, which is why we chose the mechanism. The video should save and it should have a link where you can share both via email as well as sharing through Facebook, depending on who you're attempting to share to. So it is our hope, yes, to make sure that the video is saved and available for folks to view after the fact.
There's also a question here about, does the Institute have a list of recommended people who go into institutions to do this work?
There are lots of us, so other folks are who do.
Dr. Helms, you might be muted. Oh, no, you're not. Okay.
No, I'm not. The Institute says, look around you on the screen are a number of people that I would recommend who do this work, and they would like to be paid for the work that they do.
Yes.
yeah.
What she said.
So feel free to message, for the person asking that question, feel free to use messaging to inquire if you want more specifics. Well, I thank you all on the panel for joining this evening, giving of your time to engage the community. I've enjoyed, it's again the connection for me, even though that we're talking and talking through Facebook Live. It's still good for me to be reminded and to hear from you all. I hope that you all who are listening have appreciated the conversation and discussion tonight. I encourage you to continue to engage us. We hope to see you virtually at Diversity Challenge in October. Is it October 25th? Am I making exact date? But October 2020 of this year, which is our 20th celebration. So Dr. Helms has been doing this work, at least at Boston College through the Institute, right, for 20 years. So we 23rd and 24th. Thank you, Dr. Chen. So we hope to see folks engage, where again, we have CEU workshops, and as well as we'll be celebrating some of this work, which has been done for a very long time. All right. So good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.